Hi there, and welcome to this first video that I'm doing in 2021 on the crisis of conservatism around the world. I've probably mentioned in various communiques to the Patreon community, or the Explaining History Patreon community. Last year, I had some big plans and some big goals to give you guys an awful lot more content, but unfortunately the coronavirus intervened, and for about 6 or 7 months, both myself and my wife were stuck with long-term exhaustion. So slightly out of my hands, but of course you guys have my humblest apologies for not really being able to keep up much of my end of the bargain as far as it goes on Patreon. You guys have continued to back the podcast, and so I want to create as much kind of additional content for you, as much that you'll find useful and interesting and hopefully valuable, and based around kind of analysis as much as possible. Now, what I was doing last year, what I'm going to try to continue doing, is giving kind of some insight on the long-term trends I think are shifting in the world at the moment, based around, of course, sort of like a historical perspective, and which goes slightly beyond what we normally do on the Explaining History podcast. And so this is kind of Explaining History extra, which is, I guess, the whole point of trying to really be as rewarding as possible to the people who are kind enough to financially back Explaining History. So I wanted to talk about the crisis of conservatism. And if you look at the history of the 20th century, one of the most enduring political forces is the kind of what you would call like an Atlanticist conservatism, an Anglo-American conservatism, that you also find in other first world Anglosphere countries. I don't want to equate kind of the Republican Party and the Conservatives in Great Britain too much to other parties in, say, France or Germany that you would traditionally think as having conservative values, because, of course, historically and culturally there are subtle but crucial differences, and you don't. There are different conversations, shall we say. So today I'm going to just look at a kind of a comparative analysis of the highs and lows of the Conservative Party in Britain and the Republican Party in America. And of course, in 2016, the kind of bolt of lightning moment, as Lenin described, the Kronstadt mutiny, this sort of bolt of lightning that illuminates the landscape. The bolt of lightning moment, it was the election of Trump and the Brexit referendum. But neither of these things emerged from thin air. Both of these things are phenomena with long-term roots, and I thought perhaps we could look at the Trumpist phenomenon first. The loudness of Trump and the last 4 years has drowned out the fact that throughout the Obama years, with some involvement from Trump, but significant involvement of what was thought to be the more mainstream Republican Party, there was a kind of an ongoing guerrilla campaign against Barack Obama. You only need to look at the emergent Tea Party, which developed in the last years of Bush Jr., to see how far the Republican Party had shifted towards this kind of almost slightly kind of paramilitary, or kind of at least quasi extra legal approach to dealing to kind of political resistance. If you go back even further than that, the arrival of a Republican right in the 1990s to resist the two terms of Bill Clinton, particularly led by Newt Gingrich in Congress, I think is kind of the beginnings of the phenomena. If you go back even further, you have a kind of a new right that is observable from Nixon onwards. So you have to go back to kind of almost 1968 to fully to fully kind of appreciate this. So let's go back there. So in 1968, Richard Nixon, who a kind of a much younger Trump met and admired, won power in the 1968 presidential election, partly because there was no meaningful contender following the assassination of Bobby Kennedy from the Democrat Party and the retreat of Lyndon Johnson from public life, gradually in despair over the Vietnam War. But Nixon also managed to mobilize a disaffected white conservatism against the gains that had been made, and they were actually pretty modest gains. The gains that had been made by Black Americans during the Civil Rights era, and by the perceived liberalization of society. There was what Nixon called the silent majority, who were wanting the country that they imagined existed back, this sort of country of the 1950s, and who were motivated to vote Republican for the first time in the South since the Civil War. Of course, Southerners had long bitter memories of the Republican Party, being the party of Abraham Lincoln. So the Nixon's Southern strategy involved the politicization of race, even at a time when race was supposedly meant to be being withdrawn from the acceptable spectrum of political discourse. And the way in which Nixon does this, he talks about crime. Crime to white Southerners is a code for the dangerous black male. And Nixon's pledge to restore law and order is really a pledge not just to undo the perceived excesses of the 60s, the Chicago riots and the anti-Vietnam War protests, and the lawlessness surrounding the growth in things like drug use, which actually was fairly trivial compared to criminality and drugs now. But also the perceived gains made by not just blacks and other ethnic minorities, but also by the kinds of urban West Coast and West and East Coast elites, the kind of the supposed left liberal intellectuals of New York and California, to whom the American heartlands and the South have a very kind of fractious relationship. Nixon spoke directly to these candidates, and the thing about the conservative right from the 60s onwards was not that there was a compelling economic offer, more that there were compelling cultural offers. The great and meaningful economic offer of the 20th century in America had been the New Deal. And the Republicans had always tacked to the right after the Second World War in order to present their voters with something meaningful in response. During the Truman era, particularly from the 1946 congressional elections, was the fact that the Republicans had to play on Truman's supposed weakness regarding communism and Roosevelt, the late Roosevelt's sort of coziness with Stalinist Russia, which of course he had to be fairly cordial with during the Second World War. By 1949, the existence of a Soviet bomb and the occurrence of a revolution in China going communist, were existential crises for democratic foreign policy, and the Republicans can say the Democrats are weak, they're soft on communism. Why is that? Well, there are all these, there's the kind of the hint of treason, of treachery. So in sort of the absence of a meaningful economic offer, like how I'm going to make you richer and better off, how the Republicans are going to make you richer and better off, there had to be a cultural offer. The first was anti-communism. The Nixon cultural offer was essentially kind of dog whistle racism. And so these were the ways in which it was possible to speak beyond the kind of the complexities of taxation and public spending and whether this is good or whether this is not, and speak directly to the defining prejudices of isolationism and white supremacy that run deep in through kind of American political life, or American public life, or cultural life, or social life. So that's a kind of like a history of this kind of shift to the right. During the kind of the wonder years of the Roaring '90s, when the American economy expanded, the Cold War was over, there are no more kind of villainous Soviet boogeymen to panic the American public about. The new kind of folk devil, like before 9/11, before radical Islam could be portrayed as this evil to be defended against. The new folk devil was essentially the Clinton family. It's a lot thinner and a lot less plausible, but the impeachment of Bill Clinton over compared to the kind of the many crimes of Donald Trump, some fairly kind of flimsy stuff about his having an affair with his intern, and the determination of the Republicans in the House of Representatives and the Senate to bring the Clinton government down represented a kind of two things, I think. Firstly, a determination to destroy Clinton no matter what, to destroy the Democrats no matter what, and secondly, a kind of a breach with a fundamental principle. And this isn't, anything set in stone. It is a principle of the operating of post-war democratic and republican politics. The idea that on some level there should be some meaningful commitment to making the state function, and that a political civil war between the Democrats and the Republicans, of trying essentially to stop the state from functioning by having things like government shutdowns, as we see throughout the Obama era, that this becomes preferable. And you see this pioneered by Newt Gingrich, and you see this pioneered by Mitch McConnell under Obama. This becomes preferable to any kind of meaningful cooperation with the Democrats. Now, you see, the thing is, the Democrats are not necessarily poles apart from the Republicans on a whole raft of issues. When it comes to the financialization of American society, allowing banks to do what they're deregulated worst, when it comes to allowing the offshoring of jobs, the erosion of union rights, opposition to, up until Obama, opposition to socialized Medicare, medicine, and the extension of health provision to the uninsured. There is a broad consensus between the centre ground of the Republicans and the Democrats. There's a small Democrat left and a much larger Republican right. But in economic terms, in the functioning of things, there's little to debate over. So it was never about trying to bring in economic terms to bring the Republicans to their knees. They were happy to do most of the things that the Republicans wanted. The Democrats were seen as culturally part of something that was alien to Republican voters, or the kind of the heartlands of Republican voters. And if you look at the kind of the electoral map of America over the last dozen elections or so, you can see this. You can see where the red votes and where the blue votes actually are. And the US Senate, particularly, has always been gerrymandered to favour the red states, and the Electoral College is gerrymandered to favour the red states, to essentially make sure that sparsely populated Midwestern states are always able to gang up in large numbers and outvote highly densely populated blue states. So the part of the infrastructure of American political life inevitably leans towards the right. You add into this the frustration of three branches of government frequently cancelling one another out, and the sense from the American public that the American government never does anything and never functions and never gets anything done. Well, in part of the reason for that is the writers of the Constitution ensured that that would be the case, that the US government, with a separation of powers, a Supreme Court and executive and legislative branch, would have a kind of an ability to some extent, to cancel one another out. So there's a kind of a pool of grievance and a much more militant Republican Party on political maneuvers consistently since the 1960s. And you keep seeing in the Bush Jr. Era and in the Trump era, old faces popping up, the Cheneys and the Rumsfelds and Bush Jr. and Roy Cohn, who dates all the way back to the McCarthyite era under Trump as an advisor. These kind of almost sort of cold warriors, if you will, highly kind of partisan figures there simply to win political battles